Hey everyone, I'm back with Dahlia Schweitzer, and this discussion came up from our review of the Tomorrow War, and I believe you have a shirt to commemorate that.
I do. I forgot to take into account, well, I'm actually going to adjust the microphone so the shirt can be properly displayed for the duration of our conversation. But yeah, I got some fan mail from a Film Threat supporter. And he referred to me as a vile feminist, which is a title that I've chosen to embrace.
Very good. Yeah, it was just a really minor comment, and it just I just find small comments tend to trigger a lot of people for some reason. And
well, it just it reminded me a lot of Trump calling Hillary the nasty woman. So, and I thought that especially considering our conversation today, which might be triggering for other people, that vile feminist was especially appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of like thinking, how does this apply to Alien? And I found out. So yeah, let's just get into it.
Okay.
You know, you kind of got on me a little bit about not seeing Alien, and
a little bit. I got on you a lot.
Yeah, I know.
I think I told Chris to fire you.
I think so. I believe so. I think I had to talk to HR for some reason. And you know, and on a side note, I've been actually challenged by other writers here at Film Threat that I need to start watching horror films. And I've been, you know, it's like, you know, I would say, you know, we've got a good number of writers who love horror films, and I'm more than happy to pass those off to them. And so now I think, yeah, I need to broaden my base here, get, you know, and I think Aliens is probably Alien is a good film to jump into.
This is correct.
Yeah, so I decided I'm going to give this the proper respect. So I made sure I could actually sit down and watch it with no distractions. Did it late last night on my big TV.
Whoa!
In 4K UHD, and I experienced Alien.
Were you able to sleep after that?
Yeah, you know, when I say I don't watch horror films, you know, you do kind of have to categorize things. You know, this one is more of the suspense, killer, thrasher type horror versus the more demonic, the more nightmare-inducing type horror.
Okay.
And I think maybe that's the one I'm going to put off for a while for now and just kind of stick with the killer slasher at the moment.
Okay, so you don't want to talk about Exorcist next.
Oh, yeah. Now that you bring it up, maybe I should do that. And that would okay. Yeah, maybe we'll do that next.
All right, you might want to watch that during the daytime.
I think so. But let's get back to Alien.
Okay.
So I'm trying to like log down my thoughts and feelings while watching it, and I felt like in terms of horror here, a lot of the horror has to do with just that sustained tension. You know, because quite frankly, I've heard enough about Alien, and I should say that even when it came out when I was in junior high, I kind of understood what the movie was about. And so it's not like I didn't know what was going to happen, and I didn't know that when certain setups occurred that I didn't know what was going to happen, such as landing on a planet and finding all this stuff. You know, you get that. And even the end scene where you know they spend a little too much time just her on that shuttle, and you realize, well, we know what's happening here. Because they could have easily just ended the movie. But to me, the horror just comes in this, you know, long waiting period before the kill happens, so to speak.
I mean, which is classic, like horror 101. I mean, I think that's what's interesting. I mean, there are many things about Alien that I find fascinating. But I think one is the way that it sort of fuses the science fiction and horror genres. And I think on the surface, it might seem maybe like it's more sci-fi, but it does have all these sort of like horror 101 tropes. And of course, the trope of like the monster that won't stay dead, which I think is familiar even if you've only seen a handful of horror movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, this is where these ideas cross or blend the horror and the sci-fi genre. You know, because I think a lot of the terror that happens in the movie is more in your head than it is actually on the screen. I liken it to the fact that the reason I don't give blood as often as I would is because it takes a half an hour of sitting in the room before they actually take blood from you. And it's that half hour of sheer terror and all the mind games you play that happens here. And
rethinking all your life choices.
Yeah, exactly. Or thinking about what that needle going in. And then, and then when the face hugger occurs, just the idea of, well, there's now an egg inside this guy. And you're just thinking through and feeling, maybe that's part of the reason I don't watch a lot of horror either, is because I tend to get overly empathetic and emotional. And so just the idea that there's something living in this guy, and as a man saying this,
well, that's actually really interesting. The fact that we're having this conversation as, a man versus a woman. And I think that scene in particular is meant to be extra disturbing to men. I don't know if this is correct. This is just my assumption. And as a woman, to me, when the alien pops out, that scene just sort of reads as childbirth, which, to be fair, I have never birthed a child, but I have seen it take place many times, and it's sort of like, that's what happens. Whereas I think for men, we're not used to seeing that come out of a man. So maybe that is especially triggering for a dude. I don't know. I just feel like Freud could have a field day with you and your particular triggers. And birth is, a major theme throughout the movie. And it's sort of one of the things that's really interesting. And there's I think it's like I think it's the first scene in the movie where the crew come out of the pods, right? And it's as if they're being birthed from the pods. And that's sort of like the ideal birth scenario, right? Like the pods open up and they come out fully formed and everything is very sterile and there's no blood, and it's sort of like that's the dream birth situation. And then we have, in contrast, the nightmarish birth situation, right? Where Cain is on the table and, screaming in agony and he's being held down. I mean, it's all very classical, this is how birth is often portrayed in movies, or at least, more horrific, the more horrific take where he's being like held down and then the baby pops out and then the baby gives that little like kind of sound, which is
and
like
then scampers off.
Yeah. So I think the birth trope is interesting. And I think it's particularly interesting how it's disturbed you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, quite frankly, babies aren't exactly born that way.
I mean, kind of.
I guess the more delicate way of saying is that the babies don't create an opening. The opening is already there, as opposed to just
semantics.
Yeah.
And maybe if Cain had a vagina, then the baby would have come out the vagina. But the baby had no choice but to create its own opening. So,
well, yeah,
it's a survival technique.
Yeah, and then from the other end, the face hugger and the implantation, there's certainly similarities there as well.
And the rape scene where Cain gets impregnated.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So part of me is like, I mean, we're making this very sexual and very, I don't know.
We're not making it that way. Ridley Scott made it that way.
I know. But, how much of that is story versus how much of that is, is there an intentionality like that? Or, I guess sometimes I think like maybe we are diving a little too deep in just the idea that
this is like surface level. We want to dive deep. I think it's like there's more to be found. But this, to me, it's like, is anybody going to argue with the birth? Sorry, this is like a tongue twister. The birth themes. Wow. In Alien, I feel like it's pretty clear. I mean, it'd be great if we could call Ridley up and be like, "Hey, what were you thinking?"
Yeah. Were you just thinking the alien was going to bust out, or were you making an allegory toward birth? And that's kind of where it's like, I think I think it is fair to make comparisons. The question I have is how intentional was it there, or was it something subliminal in his mind as he was writing this?
Well, as an academic who does this for a living, the answer I always provide to that question is it doesn't matter, because it seems very obvious to me that subtext is there. And even if Ridley wasn't and I'm just going to call him Ridley, even if Ridley wasn't doing it on purpose, I think artists tend to operate sometimes in this sort of unconscious way. And I think there's so much to unpack. And if you look through, you can keep going through all 4 of the Alien movies, but there's definitely this like subtext of like motherhood, for instance, right? And the fact that the computer of the ship is called Mother, right? Like and then the company is seen almost as being this sort of like Jeff Bezos patriarchal capitalistic oppressor, right? And then you have Ripley as the mother, with like the whole cat theme. And by the way, I have my Jonesy right there. And so you have the whole cat theme, where she's got to like find Jonesy before, like she puts other people at risk because she has to go find Jonesy. And then you have the scene at the end, Jonesy is like her child. And then in the sequel in Aliens, you have Newt as her child. And again, she has to go back and rescue Newt. So it's like she's the mother. And then, of course, the alien is the mother, right? We see this also, this theme that goes through all 4 of the Alien movies. And there are definite parallels between the alien as this very like primal mother kind of protecting her spawn. And then Ripley as this almost like sort of cold and calculating mother, protecting her not biological spawn, but sort of like chosen spawn, either as Jonesy or as Newt. So I think I think you'd be hard pressed to argue with me that there isn't a theme of motherhood and gender, aka, and I don't know if there's this woman named Carol Clover who wrote what's sort of regarded as this like really seminal book about gender and horror movies called Men, Women, and Chainsaws. And she's the one that came up with the concept of the final girl. You're not a horror fan, but
when you say that, I kind of have an idea what you're talking
about. But the final girl is like, what you would see in like the old slasher movies, right? It's this very common trope where you have, the woman who is left standing to take down the monster, or the not necessarily the monster, but I guess the monster. Like, doesn't have to be a demon or an alien, but the monster at the end of the movie. So she has to take him down, and all the other men fall by the wayside. The more sexual girls fall by the wayside. So the final girl usually ends up being, the one who hasn't had sex, the one who's more asexual, the one who's more intelligent. And then she's the one who's left standing and takes down the monster and is sort of victorious. And Carol Clover presented this trope as argument against the sort of popular idea that horror films are misogynistic, right? Because women are always being killed off in horror films with their blood splattered all over. And she was saying, if you do a deeper dive, you see that the fact that it's the woman, who keeps taking down the monster at the end. And I think the Halloween movies with Jamie Lee Curtis are like an excellent example of this. So
I would say the other horror film I've seen is Scream. And Scream really leans into that. I mean, it's very intentional about it.
It leans into it, but it complicates it. And I actually talk about Scream in my classes because in Scream, you have 2 final girls, right? So you have Neve Campbell and Courtney Cox, right? So you have 2 instead of 1. And then Neve Campbell and Courtney Cox are more sexual than the traditional final girl. So what's interesting about Scream is it absolutely leans into it, but then it also complicates it, which I think is what Scream does so brilliantly about horror film tropes in general. Like, I think Scream is sort of maybe an unacknowledged masterpiece in that way, where it's like, it's making reference to all these tropes, but it's not, it kind of goes one step further, right? It doesn't just make the references, it also sort of complicates them.
So let me ask you this, in terms of getting back to Aliens, where does it stand in kind of the compilation of horror films at that time in 1979? And how much is it just the fact that it is set in space and has good effects that sets it apart from the genre at this moment?
Yeah, I think in terms of science fiction, it's like the most. I mean, with the genre, it's always like it's almost like there's like a recipe or a checklist, right? So it's like, oh well, if you've got cowboys and horses and great nature vistas, then it's a Western, right? So it's like if you've got aliens and outer space, then it's sci-fi. That's sort of the very sweeping general statement. So it's like you have those elements which make it science fiction, but then of course you have the monster. And then I would even argue that in some ways Alien is perhaps a haunted house movie, which is, I mean, that's a little bit of a stretch, but just the idea of the fact that they are in, I mean, and this is sort of the idea behind haunted house movies, is like the characters are in this space that's supposed to be safe, right? It's kind of like what's outside is where it's dangerous, right? But then, thanks to Ash, the alien is brought into the safe space, and then they have to run around and try to find the alien to get it out of their home. So I think if you kind of look at it as a haunted house movie, you can sort of more easily recognize the horror elements.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. I hadn't really thought about it until you brought it up. Yeah, because they are stuck in the house, so to speak.
Yeah, and they can't leave, right? So it's like in traditional haunted house movies, like I talk about in my book, they can't leave because they can't afford to, right? Yeah. And in this one, they literally can't leave because they're in space.
Yeah, and in a way, there's a puzzle to solve in order to get out of the situation, get out of the house, or somehow deal with the danger,
right?
Which I think is fairly indicative of the more supernatural horrors.
Yeah, and I think what else is interesting is in the haunted house movies, you usually have this trope of the woman as being the one who recognizes threat and then is dismissed, right?
Yeah.
And I think you see that throughout all four of the Alien movies, where Ripley is the kind of like the first one to be like, we got a problem, and then the other characters are like, it's fine. And I think you really see this in the fourth one, which I know you still have that to look forward to. But
I know, I have a ways to go before I get to the fourth one.
What's that?
I have a ways to go before I get to the fourth one.
I'm just letting you know, because I feel like a lot of times there's this let's just say like a loss in quality, maybe when you keep cranking out the sequels. But I would argue, and I'm sure I'm going to get, some fan mail about this, but I would argue that in some ways, the fourth might be the best. And if not the best, it's definitely equal with the first one, at least in terms of the Dahlia enjoyment factor.
Yeah.
So other people can feel free to disagree. But in terms of my enjoyment, I really like the fourth.
So back to Ripley.
Yes.
One thing I was thinking about, and I actually, I spend way too much time on TikTok nowadays, but it's this idea of the female protagonist and what it means to be a female protagonist. And I think the assertion people are making today is that today's female protagonists are less realistic than the female protagonists of the past, such as Ripley and the long line of basically kick-ass female, action heroes. There seems to be a little more substance in those characters than they are now. And the thing the character they bring up is Captain Marvel, and I don't know if you've seen it, but she, it's essentially she's more like a god who has kind of been blinded by her power, or blinded from her power, or suppressed from her power. I think it's the better way to say it. Versus, and so she's already a perfect character in that movie. Versus in Alien, there's levels of imperfection and humanity that exists in Ripley.
With the superhero movies, and I'm not familiar with Captain Marvel per se, but I feel like as a general rule, I think one of the reasons why I find superhero movies to be less interesting is because the characters seem less human and less real.
Yeah. I mean,
And
Superman is probably the greatest example. He's super, he's all powerful, and therefore becomes less of a relatable character.
Yeah, and so I think that's one of the reasons why I've just always had, like, I have a harder time getting invested in superhero movies. Now, that said, like, I did, for instance, enjoy the first Iron Man, and maybe I hadn't thought about it, but maybe that's because in that one, the Robert Downey Jr. character is kind of human.
Yeah. Well, he's very flawed at the beginning of the movie.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So he's more complex than like a traditional superhero kind of super character, maybe. But I agree with you that I feel like I don't turn to the superhero movies to see sort of realistic characters. Whereas I think there is something sort of just great about Ripley as a protagonist, and that, she's tough. Her character doesn't really evolve in the first one, which is a little bit unfortunate, but is, common to these kinds of movies. Like, I think she's basically kind of the same at the end than at the beginning. But I do think if you watch all the Alien movies, that there is a bit of a narrative arc. And so I do think that she is a very enjoyable character. And I think that that's also one of the reasons why I like the fourth one, because there's sort of self-referential humor where she's making fun of elements of her character. And so there is this kind of this awareness. And but anyway, I'm sort of rambling.
Yeah.
The short answer is yes, I agree with you.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think, if I were to go into more classical gender roles here, it's this idea that that men tend to be aggressive. It's kind of like, the ones with the guns have the power, and so
careful, you'll be called a vile feminist.
I know. It's this idea that because men are physically stronger, that's one of the reasons why they are seen more as aggressors and more as the leadership type, versus in this case Ripley, to me, takes on the more instinctual nature of women. And I think she plays really into that throughout the film, that the idea of bringing Kane on board, and, she's instinctually saying no, and kind of has an idea of what the worst thing that could possibly happen will happen. And that's exactly, her instincts were right in that case. And it's a continual testing of, she has an idea of what should happen, but she's constantly being challenged by the captain and her coworkers in terms of, doing the right thing, so to speak, saving a few lives, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of what I was getting at with the comparison with haunted house films, where it's usually the woman who knows what's going on, and says, there's a ghost or a demon or the kid is possessed. And the dad/husband is always like, did you take your meds? You're being crazy.
I mean, I think the greatest example of that is when Yaphet Kotto just wants to grab a gun and kill the thing.
Right.
And then Ripley has to say, no, we need to just kind of calm down and come up with a plan.
Yeah.
And of which the plan didn't work anyways, but certainly a lot more thought out than going in with guns blazing. She
does have this sort of kind of like what you were saying, this sort of like the instinctual mother protecting her children, and protecting her space, right? And then there is it's in the second one where she has the great line where she's like, "Get away from her, you bitch," right? And it's this idea of like the woman protecting her child. And so, yeah, I think you have this sort of interesting examination of the female character. I mean, just, we had mentioned this with our discussion about the Tomorrow War, that, just the choice to have a female lead in an action movie was really unusual, right? In the original script, the character was supposed to be a guy, and Ridley Scott had insisted that it be played by a woman. And so just to have a woman in that role in general in a sort of blockbuster action film was unusual, right?
Yeah.
And then I think it's in the third one where she shaves her head, right? But there's a real level of androgyny there, right? Like she's not a girly girl, and I can definitely appreciate that they don't bog her down with the love interest, for instance, in like any of the movies. So it's like, we have, you know, like we've got the female, but we're not like necessarily bogged down with too many of the sort of tropes that do bog down women when they're on screen, which is why, for instance, it's so people can get really worked up about that scene at the end where she's walking around in her panties. And people are like, oh, well, you know, you have this whole movie with this empowered action female. And then it's like, now are we sexualizing her? We have all this skin being exposed. What is that about? And so I definitely, like, I discuss that with my students, because, you know, some of the students get really annoyed because they're like, oh, now we're back to like Hollywood objectifying the woman again.
So what, I mean, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. You know, to me, it was, you know, yeah, okay. I'm not against women in panties, but at the same time, it's like, well, it seems like maybe she would naturally do this at a point when everything seems to be calm and that she can relax a moment.
I think the way that I spin it with my students is I'm not sure that there is necessarily a right answer. You know, I think there are equally valid ways of looking at it, right? So the less aggravating response is that, you know, it's to emphasize her vulnerability, to create sort of suspense for then when the alien sort of pops up, you know. So it's like she's not wearing any kind of protective gear. She's basically naked, right? So you have the emphasizing the vulnerability. But then if you want to go for the more vile feminist take, you could say that, you know, that Ridley wants to show us that, you know, even the tough kind of androgynous action hero female can also be hot and sexually objectified. And to kind of like, so that the men aren't as threatened by this woman who is the sole survivor. So I feel like those are kind of the two different ways of looking at it.
Yeah, and maybe I see it more from, you know, if I were to progress a couple years into the 80s and go to teen sex comedies where, you know, where it's gratuitous, the skin is there because that sells.
Yeah.
And I don't think the selling point of this movie was that moment in the scene. And at the same time, she had just basically escaped an alien off a ship for the last 24 hours, and what, you're just going to stay in your uniform once you're safe and clear,
right?
You know. And so I think, sure, they could have written her to stay in her uniform, but there's an intentionality there that says, well, if we're gonna, you know, strip her down, basically, there has to be a reason for it, and it has to be a logical reason for it.
Sure. Yeah, I definitely think it's much less gratuitous than Megan Fox in Transformers, sort of, you know, dancing around in her crop top.
Yeah, unless you say they weren't selling tickets for that moment. So
no, and I think that's actually a really good point, because I think the most famous scene from that movie, of course, is the one where Kane gives birth. So I do think that that's an interesting way of looking at it. Sort of like, what is the selling point of that movie?
Yeah, I mean, Porky's didn't make millions of dollars because of its story.
Right.
The last thing, when we talked about this movie in Tomorrow War, you know, you had mentioned that there's basically a corporate element to it, you know, the evil corporation. And I was kind of like, okay, how does this fit in? And then it's like, oh, lo and behold, I understand now. And I just find it interesting. You know, I think part of it is there's always been an anti-corporate mentality in Hollywood, and especially happening at that point. But yeah, you know, there's always that next thing that companies want to do. They want to be the next thing, and you know, to find an alien. It reminds me of Jurassic Park. It's like, oh yeah, let's remake dinosaurs. That'll be cool.
Yeah,
and not really thinking
not
about the
dangerous at all. You know, like, it'll be fine.
What could go wrong? Come on.
I know, right? Famous last words in so many movies.
Yeah, and just to find out that that this whole trip, that everything here was set up by design. It wasn't an accident, so to speak.
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting because I feel like in many ways these big budget movies are uber capitalist. But at the same time, you do, like in Resident Evil, for instance, where you have like the evil corporation, right? So there is this sort of like evil corporate element in so many of these movies, whereas Hollywood is far from this kind of like troublemaker, communist, independent kind of venture. But yeah, you have the company. I mean, in this movie, it's so clear that it's a sort of critique of capitalism and how capitalism exploits its workers and doesn't care about them and all that.
Yeah, and it also goes into who's a good villain that we could bring in, and people will just accept that they're villains.
Oh, yeah.
Nazis would be the other one.
And it's fun. Yeah, Nazis are like the ultimate go-to. But it's funny when I talk to my students about Alien. I mentioned it kind of flippantly before, but I was teaching it in class, and one of my students was like, "Oh, it's like Jeff Bezos and Amazon." It's like it's such a part of the kind of the current vernacular. This idea of like Walmart or whatever, like the evil company that doesn't actually take care of its employees. So if anything, maybe it's more relevant now than it was in when Alien came out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of that was going on in the sense of, when robots were taking over the auto industry.
Right.
When technology advances, it has a severe impact on, on the way things have been done. We're seeing that now in like the Rust Belt, where, a lot of these mining companies and these factories are kind of going by the wayside. And there was no one there to basically say, hey, this industry is dying. What can we do with these current resources we have, and make sure that they have jobs, and not just leave them on the wayside to fend for themselves when they decide, hey, we'll just shut it down.
But I think fear of technology is different than critique of capitalism. And I do think that Alien has both, right? As we see with Mother and Ash, right? The robot that cannot be trusted. And it reminds me of movies like Westworld, right? Where you do have the sort of the evils of technology. 2001 is such a great example. But I do think those are two separate issues.
Yeah.
Technology gone rampant, and then evil capitalistic overlords.
Yeah. Well, and then we get into the idea of let's get an alien. Right. As cool as that would be, as maybe educational as that might be, is it the right thing to do?
Never. Yeah. Don't do this at home.
I know they really, movies like that like to lean into that. It's a bad idea, but we're gonna do it anyways. And
just you wait till you get to 4. Alien 4.
That's the thing I like about science fiction, is the fact that it's not about robots and aliens. Science fiction has always been about the human condition, the human nature, and where we're left unchecked, where we would take ourselves.
And what I like about horror movies is that horror movies are all about turning our innermost fears and anxieties out and putting them up on the screen. So there we have a nice synergy between horror and science fiction.
Yeah. So very good. All right. So I think, so I would say, I did enjoy Alien.
I would hope so.
Yeah.
We'd have to break up, Alan.
It's like watching Titanic. There's a level of work you have to do to get yourself to sit down and want to watch it, knowing what is going to happen. I guess I think what we'll do is we'll probably talk about a more recent film, and then we'll head into The Exorcist.
Ooh,
that'll be a fun one.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to that one, but
and we will never talk about Titanic.
Okay. Oh, well then maybe that's my challenge, or maybe I'll spare you. Okay, we'll see.
You'll spare me. I refuse. I will boycott the episode.
All right. Well, very good. Thanks, Dahlia, for joining me. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment. Let us know what your thoughts. We loved your comments last time. We'd love to hear your comments this time. So with that, let's get out of here.